They asked me if I could just eat in the kitchen this year, the house I helped them buy, the holiday I spent a lifetime making. If you've ever been handed silence in a home you helped build, maybe you'll understand what comes next. Now, I sit beside a microwave hum instead of laughter. The scent of gravy still warms the air, but I eat alone, with plastic forks and stories no one asked to hear. It started the way holidays often do now, with too much noise and not enough notice. The front door creaked open around 10 a.m., and I stepped in with my old brown pie carrier cradled in my arms like something sacred. It was cherry this year, homemade crust, the kind that takes real butter and time. No one greeted me at the door. I could hear voices upstairs, children yelling over video games. My son's laugh trailing down the staircase, warm but distant. I stood there for a moment, brushing a loose leaf off my coat, unsure whether to call out or simply blend in. The dining table was already set, linen runner, sparkling glasses, name cards written in neat modern calligraphy. I didn't see mine. I thought, maybe it's just not out yet. Maybe Lorraine, my daughter-in-law, had simply forgotten the place card. She was always busy. She liked things just so. I didn't want to intrude, didn't want to become one more thing to fix. So I placed the pie gently on the counter, tucked in a corner behind the Instant Pot and a crate of store-bought rolls. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon, rosemary, and just a hint of something burnt. It reminded me of all the Thanksgivings I used to host, back when folding chairs were dragged from the garage and everyone had a seat even if their knees knocked together. "Mom, you brought pie," my son finally noticed, sweeping through to grab something from the fridge. He kissed the top of my head as he passed. His lips were cold. "We're trying to keep desserts light this year. You know how everyone's watching carbs." I smiled. Of course, I'd only spent all day on it. I sat at the edge of the kitchen stool, the one with the wobbly leg, folding and unfolding the napkin in my lap. I wasn't needed in the kitchen. Everything was already measured, timed, digital. No one asked about my stuffing recipe. No one asked me anything at all. When dinner was called, they streamed in like a parade, kids first, then the younger adults, then Lorraine's parents. I followed behind, slower, careful not to step on anyone's heels. And then came the words, soft, but final. "Oh, Mom, there's not really room at the table this year, but we made you a little spot in the kitchen, just for today." She pointed to the folding tray next to the oven, a plastic plate, a plastic fork, a paper napkin from last Halloween with a faded ghost. I said nothing, smiled even. I didn't want to make a scene. I've been swallowing scenes my whole life. So I sat, alone, while laughter echoed from the other room. Every sound, clink of wine glasses, scrape of silverware, the burst of shared memories, reminded me I wasn't part of it. Not really. And the worst part wasn't the kitchen. It was that no one came to check on me. Transition to part 2. Later that night, I washed every dish by hand, like I used to, and as the water ran warm over my fingers, I remembered the years when this house smelled like my cooking, and my name still meant something. Back then, I didn't need place cards to know where everyone sat. It was instinct, memory, muscle. The twins, Michael and Jonah, always elbowed each other over the last buttered roll, so I'd separate them. Caroline liked to sit near the window, where the light hit her hair just so, and she'd tilt her chin like she was in a movie. My husband Hank had his corner, always at the end, always one hand resting on my knee under the table, like we shared a secret the world had no right to know. I remember those years as golden, though maybe they weren't. There were arguments, burnt casseroles, broken glasses. But the house was full of noise, of life, of need. And I was at the center of it all, without even trying to be. The kitchen smelled like cloves and coffee by sunrise. I would rise before everyone, sometimes in darkness, and begin, peeling apples, kneading dough, pressing pie crusts into the old ceramic dish my mother gave me before she passed. That dish had a crack in it, a fine hairline running from rim to base, but I never threw it out. Some things don't need fixing, they just need gentle hands. There wasn't much money. Not really. Hank worked at the paper mill until his back gave out, and then I started sewing. Curtains, doll clothes, even wedding dresses if someone in the neighborhood needed it. We never had savings, just envelopes, tucked into drawers, labeled in my handwriting, grocery, gas, Christmas, college. And still, we managed. We had lights and music, and sometimes even laughter that bubbled up from somewhere real. I remember one Thanksgiving. We couldn't afford a turkey, so we had fried chicken and cranberry sauce from a can. The kids still talked about it like it was the best meal of their lives. It wasn't the food. It was the way we were all there, full of each other, not just plates. But I see now, those memories are mine alone. They don't live in my son's voice anymore. They don't flicker behind his eyes when he looks at me. To him, I'm just mom, or grandma, or worse, someone else's responsibility. The woman who helped pay the down payment when they said they were drowning. The woman who cashed in her pension, sold Hank's truck, and said, "We'll figure it out." I didn't ask for the house back. I didn't ask for rent. I just wanted to matter. But now I sit in a kitchen that smells like someone else's recipes, someone else's choices. And the hardest part is this: I don't think they remember how much I gave. Transition to part 3. That night, after the dishes, I heard Lorraine laugh from the hallway. She's lucky we still let her live here. And I smiled it off. But inside, I had already cracked. It happened over something simple. It always does. 2 days after Thanksgiving, the house had quieted. Decorations still clung to the mantel like forgotten promises. The dining room smelled of candle wax and leftover stuffing. Everyone was tired of each other, as families often are when the warmth fades, and the dishes remain. I was folding laundry, not mine, theirs. I don't know when that became part of my role, but it did. Shirts I never wore, socks I never bought. Little piles for people who didn't seem to notice that my hands were always moving. Lorraine walked past the laundry room, barely glancing in. "Hey," she said, not stopping. "Next time you do a load, can you not mix the kids' clothes with ours? I mean, no offense. It's just, they have sensitive skin." She didn't wait for an answer. And that's what broke me, not the words, the walk by. The fact that I had folded 5 loads that week, perfectly, gently, like I used to when my children were babies, and their onesies smelled like powder and sleep. The fact that I had sorted their colors, matched their socks, even mended a little rip in Jonah's shirt that no one mentioned. But all it took was one careless sentence, a command, really, to remind me where I stood. I wasn't family. I was help, unpaid, unnoticed, unwanted, except when I was useful. And when you've given your whole life to people, when your bones ache from years of lifting everyone but yourself, being spoken to like that feels like being erased. I carried the laundry basket back to my room, hands trembling, not with rage. I've never had room for rage, but with something quieter. Something colder. I sat on the edge of the bed, the twin bed they put in the guest room when I moved in, the one with the floral sheets Lorraine got on sale and said were just fine for now. And I cried. not loudly, not in the way that needs comforting. I cried like someone who's used to it, who knows how to let tears fall without ruining the moment. And when I was done, I reached for the drawer beside my bed. Inside, folded in half, was a bank statement, the last of my savings. A number written in bold black ink, fewer zeros than I had hoped, but it was something. I stared at it for a long time, not because I needed more money, but because I realized how much of it had already gone into this house, gone into people who would never say thank you, people who joked in the hallway that I was lucky to live here, people who forgot whose name was once on the deed to the house they now called theirs. The silence started to feel heavier than the noise. For days I moved through the house like steam, warm, fading, always vanishing before anyone noticed I'd been there. I refilled the coffee pot, took out the trash, folded blankets they left on the couch after movie nights I wasn't invited to. No one said unkind things, but no one said kind ones either. There's a cruelty in being ignored. It's the kind that doesn't bruise, so no one sees it, but it aches all the same. One evening I passed the living room and saw them all on the sofa. Lorraine, Michael, the boys, even the dog curled between them. A picture-perfect family. The light from the TV painted their faces gold. And for a moment, I stood there, just watching. Not one of them turned around. I wasn't angry. I was invisible. I went back to my room, that small rectangle of carpet and obligation, and closed the door gently. No one would knock. They never did. I sat at my desk, an old writing table Hank refinished in 1982, and opened the drawer. Inside were letters, dozens of them, some from my sisters, some from my old neighbor Ruth, who still sends me holiday cards with glittery snowmen, and some I'd written to myself, yes, to myself. Little scraps of memory, old recipes, notes in the margins of magazines, a life I was still trying to keep track of, even as it slipped quietly from under my feet. I picked up my pen and wrote one more line. Today I walked into a room where I wasn't needed, and I finally felt it in my bones. I no longer live here. I only remain. The words didn't scare me. They didn't feel dramatic. They felt like truth, finally spoken. That night I didn't sleep much. The wind shook the window screen, and I pulled the blanket up over my shoulder like I used to do for my babies when they stirred. At 3 a.m., I got up. Not to make coffee, not to check the thermostat, not to tend to someone else's needs. I stood in the middle of the room and whispered into the dark. Perhaps I stayed too long in a place I no longer belonged, and once I said it, I couldn't unhear it, couldn't unknow it, couldn't pretend anymore. Transition to part 5. The next morning, I found an old photograph, faded, wrinkled, forgotten behind a drawer. It was me, holding Michael when he was 3, my eyes full of joy, my hands full of love, and I realized then I'd given everything I had. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped being seen. I sat with that photograph for hours. It wasn't the composition or the lighting. It wasn't even Michael's little face, grinning up at me with a peanut butter smear on his chin. It was mine, my face. I was glowing, radiant even, tired, yes. You could see the soft hollows under my eyes, the kind that come from night feedings and never-ending laundry. But I was alive in that photo, not just breathing, living. I kept staring at it, trying to remember what it felt like to be her, the woman with purpose in her arms and hope in her eyes. Back then, I made magic out of nothing. I turned day-old bread into casseroles. I sewed Halloween costumes from leftover fabric scraps and old pillowcases. I braided hair, packed lunches, cleaned scraped knees, and remembered every birthday, even when no one remembered mine. I was the glue, the kind that held everything together, even when I was cracking. And for a long time, I believed that was enough. That being needed was the same as being loved. That being useful was the same as being seen. But I see now, there's a danger in teaching people that you'll always be there. They start to believe it's your duty, not your choice. I used to think my sacrifices were invisible because they were quiet. But now I wonder if they were invisible because no one ever bothered to look. And that's the part that cuts the deepest. Not that I gave so much, but that they never paused to ask what it cost me. I remember the day we signed the check for the house. Michael had called in a panic. Lorraine was crying in the background. They needed help, just a boost. And I gave it, without hesitation, without paperwork, without even asking what would happen later. I sold Hank's old truck, the one he loved. I emptied the little account we'd saved for emergencies. I told myself this was the emergency, but the emergency was becoming permanent, and I stopped asking questions the day I realized the answers would only hurt. Sometimes silence becomes survival. I folded the photograph and placed it back in the drawer. Then I stood and looked around the room, this small space they'd given me, this gift I was supposed to be grateful for. And I whispered, not with anger, but with a quiet certainty. I had to leave, not out of anger, but because I, too, deserved to live. There's something sacred about folding. It's an act of care, of order, of rhythm. Mothers do it without thinking, press, crease, smooth, as if the very act can fix what's fraying in life. But that morning, as I packed, I folded not for them, but for me. I began with the small things, the cardigan with the missing button, my old slippers, frayed at the heel, soft from years of memory, a photograph of me and Hank at the lake, sunburned and laughing, before the boys, before the mortgage, before the ache of being overlooked began to settle in. Each item I placed in my suitcase wasn't just fabric or paper. It was proof that I had lived a life before this hallway, this guest room, this folding tray beside a stove. I left behind the linen napkins Lorraine said were too wrinkled. I left the recipe cards no one asked for. I even left the pie dish. Some things don't follow you. They stay in places where your love went unnoticed. I didn't write a note. I didn't slam a door. I've never believed in goodbyes that echo. Instead, I sipped tea on the edge of the bed, the last cup I'd brew in that house, and watched the sunlight spill across the floor like a quiet kind of freedom. No one knocked on the door. No one asked where I was going, and somehow that made leaving easier. Before I zipped the suitcase, I placed one final thing inside. A cloth pouch filled with my sewing needles, the same ones I'd used to hem pants, stitch Halloween capes, patch jeans that kept being torn by growing knees. They'd served everyone but me. Now they'd come with me. I didn't leave out the front door. I didn't want ceremony. I walked around the back, down the narrow steps that led to the garden. It was still early. The leaves were still damp, the sky still soft with morning gray. For a moment I stood there, hand on the wooden gate. I could hear the boys laughing upstairs, their voices high and happy. It didn't hurt. Not anymore. I had been the echo in that house long enough. Now it was time to become a voice again. I never knew silence could feel this gentle. Transition to part 7. Later that day I arrived at Ruth's. She met me with warm coffee, a thick quilt, and no questions. Just a smile and a whisper. Welcome home. Ruth's house smelled like cinnamon and wood polish. The The kind of place where quilts are never just decoration. They hold warmth and stories. Where coffee is brewed in an old Mr. Coffee machine that grumbles before it sings. Where silence doesn't sting, because it's not covering anything up. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't say, "It's about time." She just set out a second mug, plopped in 2 sugar cubes the way I like, and said, "There's a guest room, but it's not for guests. It's for you." I hadn't heard that tone in a long time, the kind that says you belong without needing to earn it. We spent that first afternoon on the porch, the 2 of us in our robes, feet tucked under wool blankets, watching birds flit across the backyard like they had secrets they'd never share. I told her about Thanksgiving, the folding chair, the plastic utensils, the paper napkin with the cartoon ghost. She winced, not dramatically, but in that way real friends do, when they hurt with you. "I've got real forks," she said, "heavy ones, silver." And we both laughed until the tea went cold. The days passed slowly after that, deliciously slow. I started writing again, just small things, notes to myself, recipes no one asked for, memories I thought I'd forgotten. Ruth had a little desk by the window, and in the drawer was a stack of old stationery, floral borders, yellowing edges, the kind you don't see anymore. She said I could have it. I wrote about the lake house, about Hank's laugh when it echoed off the water, about the way my son used to cling to me like I was the only safe place in the world. And then I wrote about the now, about what it feels like to eat alone in the kitchen of a house you helped buy, about how quiet can either bury you or set you free. It was the first time in years I wrote for me. One morning I found a small package outside my room, a fountain pen wrapped in a hand towel tied with twine, a note beside it. "You still have stories left. I hope you'll write them. R." And I did. Every Sunday, Ruth and I would brew a fresh pot of coffee and read to each other. Sometimes we'd cry. Sometimes we'd laugh. Sometimes we'd just nod and let the silence speak for us. No one needed me to fix anything. No one asked me to fold their shirts, to wash their dishes, to stay out of the way. I was simply me. Not everyone needs me, but I need myself more than ever. Transition to part 8. One day a letter came, handwritten, postmarked from the town I left behind. It wasn't long, just a few lines. But in those few words, a door cracked open. The envelope was cream-colored, thick and slightly bent at the corner, as if someone had second-guessed sending it, then did anyway. My name was written in Michael's handwriting. I stared at it for a while, fingers tracing the ridges of ink. It had been months since I left. Not a call, not a question, just absence, the kind that deepens before it heals. Ruth found me on the porch, still holding the letter. "Read it," she said, setting a cup of tea beside me. "Or don't, but let it be yours." I waited until the steam from the tea turned to wisps. Then I opened it. It wasn't long. Michael never was one for long letters, but it was enough. "Mom, I saw your recipe box today." Lorraine was about to toss it. I stopped her. "It still smells like cinnamon and ink and you." I didn't know how far gone things were. I didn't hear what you weren't saying, but I do now. I hope you're safe. I hope someone is making you tea the way you like it. I miss your pie, but mostly I miss you. Michael, that's all. No apology, not really, but also not nothing. I folded the letter carefully, like something sacred. I didn't cry. I didn't need to, because something in me had already shifted. I looked out across Ruth's garden, where sunflowers leaned into the light and bees worked without witness. The world goes on even when you're not seated at the table. Especially then. I stood, walked out barefoot onto the grass, and found the old wooden bench beneath the plum tree, the one Ruth called the thinking spot. I sat there with my tea, the letter in my lap, and let the wind carry the silence around me like a shawl. I didn't need to go back. I didn't need them to understand everything. Some things are meant to stay softly unsaid, but I could forgive, not for them, for me, because my story didn't end in that kitchen. It didn't end with plastic utensils or paper napkins or overheard laughter I wasn't invited into. It kept going, in ink, in tea, in morning light, in this breath, and the next. Perhaps forgiveness is how I begin again.